Recording has begun.
Okay, so I guess that's the cue for us to begin. All right. So today what we'll do is we'll continue with our second class on the main building blocks of the sensors. So can someone remind me what are the main building blocks that we discussed last time? Just a minute. Somebody said analyte. Okay.
Receptors.
Are you looking into your notes from from the classroom notes? Okay. Okay. So receptors,
Transducers.
Transducers,
Amplifiers.
amplifiers, and the electronics. Okay. So electronics and interface display. Okay. So we know analyte is the parameter, the chemical that we want to monitor. Receptor is the stuff that selectively interacts with our interested parameter to produce a specific signal. And this interaction is translated into some sort of like a readable signal. It could be electrical, it could be optical signal by the transducer. And then you have these inbuilt electronics to amplify that signal, because usually the signal is pretty weak. If it is optical, the signal will be so weak that you won't be able to see that difference. So all these electronics will help you, increase that signal to noise ratio. And then finally the interface to basically see it. Okay, so can somebody tell me how can we classify the sensors, based on our last class? We classify. Remember, we did some small thing, quiz stuff.
Yeah.
Does anybody remember?
So it can be either classified by analyte or
Okay, based by analyte. Okay,
or receptor
or receptor. Okay,
or the transducer.
or transducer. Okay. Can things be classified among these?
For analyte, they can be physical
A physical or chemical? Okay.
receptor can be
Receptors could be
the catalytic or non-catalytic.
catalytic or non-catalytic, or affinity based. Catalytic, affinity. And transducers,
Can be piezoelectric or
piezoelectric. Okay.
electrochemical
Electrochemical,
or optical.
or optical. Okay, cool. All right. So, okay. So we last time we discussed the catalytic receptors, the enzymatic and the non-enzymatic, and today we will discuss a little bit about the affinity and the different types of transducers that you could use for affinity-based sensors. Okay, so again, just like the catalytic-based sensors, the transducers for affinity-based sensors are also pretty similar, just like these: optical, electrochemical, and piezoelectric. Let's take the case of electrical-based. Now, if the transducer is electrical-based, what could be the transducer if it is an electrical-based system? Electrode, right?
Yeah.
It will be an electrode. Okay. So remember, I had used the same slide last time. Electrodes could be rigid, flexible, stretchable, depending on the application. Now, the one key difference is, last time when we were discussing these catalytic sensors, we knew that when that analyte and the receptor, when they are interacting, they produce some current signal, right? Like this is the enzyme, then the substrate, the enzyme and the substrate react, produce electron, and you basically measure the electron, and then you can quantify the amount of the substrate or the analyte that is present. But that's not the case with the affinity-based sensor, right? There is no current generation. Your antibody, this Y-shaped molecule, will interact with antigen just by physical interaction. Same is the case with the DNA and the DNA. So the complementary DNA and the DNA structure will just interact just because of physical interactions. Same is the case with the aptamer. So there is no current that is being generated in this case. So how can we use an electrode? You need, like, how do you do that? So if there is no inbuilt current generation, what you could do is you could introduce an external chemical. So this is just one of the examples that I'm showing over here. So what you have is you have the electrode. Now you put the antibody on top of it. Now you will ask me, how do you put the antibody on the sensor and everything? All these parts will come later, so we will discuss about this. Okay. So if you have an electrode which has these antibodies attached to it, right? So now this surface has become selective to this particular antigen because you have modified it with that particular antibody. Now when you put the sample in it, the antigen, which is the analyte, will come and interact with your antibody. Okay. What you also do is in the same sample, you purposely add this additional chemical also. And this chemical is the one that actually produces the electron. Okay. So what you have is you have the electrode and you have this chemical that produces electrons. But between this species and your electrode, you have this non-conductive barrier. Okay. So first you have the antibodies and then you have the antigen. Now, as the concentration of this antigen increases or changes, the resistance that this electron is going to face to pass through this membrane and then reach the electrode is going to change depending on how much amount of antigen is present. Because we have fixed the amount of antibodies. The antibodies amount is fixed, right? It's just the amount of antigen that is going to change depending on the sample that you're using. If there is more antigen, more amount of these antigen will be affixed on the electrode, and hence more blocking will be experienced by this electron producing species to interact with the electrode and to give that electron. Okay, so here as you can see, this is the resistance for this electron transfer across this membrane. And this is the concentration of some analyte that we want to measure. So you can clearly see as the concentration increases, the resistance increases. Okay, and this is how you can measure the specific chemical. So like if you have some unknown sample, you basically measure what is the resistance. And once you know the resistance for this reaction to occur, you can estimate it. Oh, okay, the resistance is around 9 kilo ohms. That basically means the concentration is something along this. So it's like a logarithmic plot, so you'll have to take the exponential of it to calculate. But you can approximately calculate the concentration. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's take the another case of optics-based affinity sensors. So here I take an example of a DNA sensor. Now, broadly speaking, what happens is these are your sensors. So these are gold nanoparticles that are affixed with the DNA. Okay, and these DNA interact with your analyte DNA. So when you add the sample into your sensor solution, this analyte DNA interacts with this DNA that is already present on the gold nanoparticles, and this causes aggregation of the gold nanoparticles to take place. And that's why the color changes from red to blue. Now, one will ask, I have never seen gold which is red in color or blue in color. And the other question is, why does the color change? Let's just assume, like for argument's sake, the color of gold is red. Why does it change from red to blue? Just because it got aggregated. These are all the properties of nanomaterials. When you take bulk materials and really go down to the nano size, they have like really unique properties because of which it behaves like this. And we will be discussing the physics behind this Why gold nanoparticles have red color, and not just red color, it can have yellow, orange, pink, depending on the size. So we'll discuss why they have these specific colors and why do they change color when they start aggregating. Okay, so I kind of want to simplify this a little bit. So let me just take a simple example here. Let's say if you want to detect a DNA, and we from our last class, we know that the DNA is made of 4 bases, right? A, T, G, and C, right? And A interacts with T and G interacts with C. A will only interact with T and G will only interact with C. And this is why the complementary DNA, the only one that will interact with this will be T, A, C, and G. Okay? Now let's say if I have a analyte, I'm going to take a very simple analyte, which is T, 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 G, 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 and G. I mean, they are not usually this simple, but that's just for argument's sake. Okay, this is my analyte. So what would, like, if I want to detect this analyte, I'll need a complementary that specifically interacts with this guy, right? And that will be A, C, C. Okay, so I know if I want to detect this, I need a probe, which is basically this one. Now let's say that I break this in the middle. Okay, so I basically have 2 DNA structures, AAA and CCC, and I take this A, and I take a gold nanoparticle which is red in color, and attach this guy over here. So A. Okay, and this one, I take another gold nanoparticle. Okay, and this is C. Okay, so if in a solution, if I have these particles, okay, these are not going to interact with each other because they don't have no affinity, right? They don't have any tendency. So these gold nanoparticles are going to be separate from each other and they will maintain their red color, okay? But the moment in the sample I add my analyte, what's going to happen is this is going to bind with this is going to bind with this. So what you end up is with this. So A. I'm going to change the color. And C. No, sorry, it was C. And you have another red. This is red. And you have your analyte, which is basically going to be T, and they're the exact same thing. So this is going to be the bridge that basically brings these 2 particles which have no tendency to come close together. It basically brings them together. And it's only this sequence that can do that. And this is why you can, and when they come closer, they change the color towards blue in color. Okay, so you'll be able to detect this because of the selectivity of these probes that are attached to these 2 different gold nanoparticles. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so moving on. The next case we are going to take is piezoelectric. As the name suggests, piezo means force, electric means some sort of current or charge. So when there is some force applied, a charge or a current or a voltage is basically generated. So again, let's take the case of, say, a simple sensor with antibodies attached on it. So you have your antibodies attached on a surface, and then let's say this time we are detecting viruses. So the virus come and attach on the surface selectively. Now, basically what's happening is if you have a very sensitive like a weighing balance. Okay, consider this as a very, very sensitive weighing balance, and you have these, these chemicals, these materials that only specific materials go and attach. Okay, so basically the weight that is being, the mass that is being loaded on this really sensitive mass balance is going to change depending on whatever chemical that you want to detect. Basically, what you have done is you have taken this stainless steel thing and you have somehow transformed this into a selective surface. So this surface only will allow specific types of analyte to interact. Okay, so this is how basically a quartz crystal microbalance works. So what it does is this is a piezoelectric material. It has a particular frequency at which it resonates. And that resonant frequency is dependent on the amount of mass that is loaded on top of it. Okay, so as the mass that is loaded on top changes, the resonant frequency of this microbalance shifts. So by measuring how much it is shifting, you can estimate how much amount of mass that is being immobilized on top of the surface. So this is the very famous Aubrey equation. So you can clearly see the change in the resonant frequency of this microbalance depends on the mass that is loaded on it. And the way we make it selective that only the mass of the chemical that we want to detect, it affects the frequencies by functionalizing it with specific receptors. Okay, so in this case, we functionalize it with antibodies, but you could do it with DNA as well. Okay, if you want to detect DNA.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I understand that we're talking about microbalance, so it has to be really small in size.
Not really small in size, but really sensitive.
Sensitive?
Yeah.
So basically my question is that it senses the change in the force that the extra loaded masses exert.
Yeah, so basically think of it as like a vibrating plate, okay?
Yeah.
And it is vibrating and it has a particular frequency at which it vibrates the most.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it is like vibrating. And this frequency depends on the mass of the of your piezoelectric material. Okay, so now let's say it has a frequency F. Okay, and now let's say you put the solution on top of it and some of your analyte goes and binds. So now the mass has changed. It is no longer its initial, say, M0, right? It has changed to some M1 or M2. So the resonant frequency is no longer F. It is going to be something like F1 or F2 or whatever, So depending on the amount of mass that is attached on the surface of this balance, you can estimate the concentration.
Sure. So my question was that the mass exerts, it's a piezoelectric material.
Yeah.
The mass exerts force, that force is mg, and gravity acts downwards. What if the sensors, electrodes are vertical?
Yeah, but in force, it is mg. The mass is really small. The g is constant. But what you have is like a very small mass. So you can't literally have although I gave the example of a balance where you just put the whatever stuff on it and it measures the force. In these microbalances, they are not measuring the force because the force is really small.
Is it impactful?
I mean, each of these, like most of these chemicals, even viruses and all these things, like each particle is in like femtograms, not in femtograms, it would be like immeasurable. It's extremely difficult to measure these small molecules. So you're not really measuring the force. What you're measuring is the shift in the frequency, okay, which depends on the mass. There is no force over here, there's just mass. Okay. Does that make sense? So here I have a short video just to show how this QCM system works. So this is the crystal microbalance. Now what you'll do is, this is just plain gold electrodes. So you'll first make it selective to a particular chemical. So you'll first attach those antibodies on top of it to make it selective to a particular chemical. Okay, so now this surface has become selective to a particular chemical. Now you flow your sample. Now this red one is not selective, so that's why it is not attaching, it just goes and goes away. But the blue one is, and that's why only the blue one goes, and as you can see in the plot, the frequency goes down, the frequency shifts, because only when the blue, and the actual analyte interacts. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Okay, so we talked about chemical sensors, different types of receptors, transducers. Now let's talk a little bit about physical analytes, say temperature and force. Again, as expected for physical analytes also, we have electrical, optical, and piezoelectric. Now, there's a slight difference between the major components of sensors for physical analytes. You don't really have a separate receptor part. Usually the receptor and the transducer kind of are combined together, okay, because the transducer is designed in a way that so that it becomes selective to a particular force or temperature or whichever parameter you want to measure. Again, this is like the most simplest. So do not think of all the sensors to be following exactly the same rules, okay? So we'll talk about some of the transducers. So the two transducers that we'll talk about is electrical and optical. So let's take the case of a electrical based, so electrical resistance, the same thing. So thermistors, as the name suggests, as the temperature changes, the resistance of these components change. So by simply measuring the resistance, you can estimate the temperature. Now there are two types of, there are different types of materials, N-type semiconductors that you could use, P-type semiconductors, and this is the equation of how does the number of carrier charges in these semiconductors change as the temperature changes. So you can see there's like an exponential relation between the charge carriers and the temperature. Now, these thermistors can be classified broadly into two categories: negative temperature coefficient and positive temperature coefficient. Okay, as you can clearly see from the plots, in the negative one, as the temperature increases, the resistance decreases, and the opposite happens in the positively charged. So as the temperature increases, the resistance also increases. Okay, now each one of them, they have their own pros and cons. These NTC ones are fast and low cost. But if you want like really sensitive temperature measurements, PCT are the ones that you should go for. But these are not very easily miniaturized, and they are kind of expensive as well. Okay, the other form of resistance change is directly measuring resistance. You don't need to use like thermistors and all these things. So basically, what you do is you take a conductive metal. And we know that the resistance of the metal depends on the temperature. Okay, so as the temperature changes, the resistance changes, and then you can estimate the temperature depending on the resistance change. Now, let's say I want to develop a highly sensitive temperature sensor, and I have two resistance-based approaches. Which approach should I go and why? So we have the thermistors type and these RTDs type, right? So which option would be a good option for me? I just care about the high sensitivity. Resistance? Why?
That relationship was more linear, but the last one was like a very short.
Mm-hmm.
Harder to reflect the accurately.
Really? Hi. And now she's switching, huh? Just because.
I have my reason.
Okay.
I didn't even say I wanted to go with this. I think I would like to go with thermistor only because this is a component of P naught,
Mm-hmm.
which is the reference, going by the application that you have shown, the T naught might change for the body.
No, T naught depends on your device structure and the materials. So T naught is constant for a particular device. It's not going to change. Okay, so it is basically an intrinsic property of your device. So once you characterize that, you already know what T naught is. Okay, I'll give a hint. What you were saying is in the right direction, but your interpretation is kind of not right, I think. Okay, I gave a hint now. It's basically like literally giving out the answer now. So we have a linear relationship, right? We have a linear relationship for this guy. And then for the thermistors, we have an exponential. It can be like this or it could be down depending on the NTC or PTC, whatever we are using. Now, if I want to develop a highly sensitive temperature sensor, I want the signal to change as much as possible for a very small temperature variation, right? So let's say if I want to measure somewhere in between this tiny gap, okay, when the temperature changes from T0 to T1, okay? So in this small gap, just see how much difference this is going to be compared to this. This is going to be something small, right, the change. But here it will be much larger, right? So the exponential is always going to give you a much bigger signal. So in that case, you'll use like a thermistor for a highly sensitive one. Again, as you can see here, you can really miniaturize them, you can make it flexible, blah, 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 all of that stuff. Thermistor is a lot more complicated. And it's certainly more expensive. But when sensitivity is required, you kind of have to go with that. Okay, so I'm sure at least some of you must have seen these, colorful plates that change temperature, change color depending on the temperature. Right? So you can see the guy is putting it on top of a hot coffee. You can clearly see the color changing. So these are also, you can use these as a temperature sensor, right? You can just by looking at the color change, you can estimate what the concentration is, at least roughly. The question is, how do these work? Did anybody think about how did this work? Has anybody even seen this before? Nobody has seen. I can't believe this. You nodded. You did say it. So
the same like a lot of like the cups nowadays, if you pour hot water inside, it will have like a different picture or something.
Yeah. Yeah, but have you thought about what could be the mechanism of this?
It might be a temperature sensitive chemical that when it goes like to a different temperature, it will like two parts will couple together, be a different color, or like if they separate it, and cause it a different color.
So what you're describing is something that we'll discuss later, just after this thing, okay? Because those are like leuco dyes. They are like dye molecules that change color depending on the structure of a single molecule. But these are basically liquid crystals. Okay, so when the temperature is low, these large molecules, they pack together in a very well-defined structure, just like a crystal would. Okay, so it behaves more like a solid. When you heat that, it goes in this liquid crystal stage, which is kind of in between the complete liquid state if you heat it really high. And like, so this is the solid state and this is like the liquid state. And somewhere in between is this liquid crystal where it is partially behaves like a liquid, but it also has some, structures, some order structure within itself. So in this narrow range, these liquid crystals have temperature sensitivity. Okay, and in the next slide I'll show. So it depends on depending on the structure and the overall chemistry of these individual entities, they can have different orders in the liquid crystal phase. So here I show an example. So you have these ordered liquid crystals. When it is hot, these order structures, these planes are basically closer to each other. Okay, so you have this blue light, and when it is cold, these plates kind of separate out, and then you have a red light. And it's based on Bragg's law. Does anybody remember Bragg's law from their physics or ECE, basic optics class? What is that?
And so basically the refracted wavelength of the light is the integral multiple of the distance between each of the crystallites. So n lambda is 2 sine theta.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So you have, so depending on the space between these planes, the wavelength that will be refracted will depend on the spacing between these planes. So as the planes increases, the distance between the planes increases, wavelength increases. That basically means a red shift. The red light has higher wavelength than the blue light, but when they are close, it becomes blue in color. Does that make sense? This is what you are discussing. Thermochromic dyes. Okay, so what you have is a heterocyclic compound which is temperature sensitive. So as the temperature changes, it could go from color to colorless or colorless to color, depending on what kind of chemistry you're using. The problem with this compared to liquid crystals is while you can detect a broad range of temperatures, the sensitivity is low. So just like your thermistor situation, and also you have very limited range of dye molecules that you could actually use. So that also kind of restricts the kind of applications that you could go for. Okay, now let's move on to transducers for pressure sensors. Again, we will discuss electrical and optical. Let's take the case of electrical. So here I show a piezo resistive. Piezo means pressure force. Resistive. So as you apply the force, the resistance changes. Okay. So here what we have is a surface on which you want to measure the force. And what you do is you put a thin layer of metallic material on top of it as form of an electrode. Now, as this underlying surface on which you want to measure the force, as the force is applied, these thin metals can get damaged because they are thin metals, right? They are going to get damaged. They are not like thick, bulky materials. So what you will experience, what these metals are going to experience like micro cracks. I shouldn't say metals, but conductive material, okay? Yeah, so it could be, people have used conducting polymers as well. So it's going to crack because of the force that is being applied on on the surface, and hence the resistance is going to change. So it could be normal, so you can apply the force directly on top, or you could if this is the substrate, you could just pull it, and the resistance is going to change. And based on that resistance change, you can estimate how much force is being applied. Now, one thing that you may want to think about is you have a surface on which I want to measure the force. Let's say it's a textile material, okay? And then you put your pressure sensor on top, okay? So this is the sensor, and this is some textile, okay? We know that the resistance is going to change if you apply the force from here, or you apply if you pull it along this direction. It's going to change. How do you develop a sensor that is selective to a particular direction? If I want to only measure changes in this direction, but you know that the resistance is going to change if you apply some force on the top. Let's say while I'm wearing this clothing, and I want to measure only when the cloth is being stretched. Okay, but what is going to happen is while I'm wearing, when I'm moving, it is stretching, and let's say somebody just hits me or something like that. There's going to be some normal force. So there are these multi-directional forces acting on your substrate, and your your force sensor is going to just measure all of it. It has no way, it is agnostic to the direction. So think about it. If you want to develop a direction sensitive strain sensor, how could we do that? Something to think about. The other way of measuring force is capacitive. This is basically a simple double plate capacitor. We have studied about double plate capacitors. You know, you have two plates and then dielectric medium in between. And the capacitance depends on the area and the distance between the plate. So, just like this situation, if you apply a force on the top, the two plates are going to come closer to each other. If you stretch it, the area is going to change. And in fact, when you stretch it, the area is going to change and also the distance is going to change. So both of them are going to change. So this is another way of measuring forces. And a lot of these touch screens, earlier ones were piezoelectric ones, like the first example one, and now most of these are basically capacitive.
I'm sorry, I just
Sure.
have to ask something. I understand that, going back to the question that you
Yeah.
asked. So the fact that we are not using piezo-resistive, piezoelectric material to make those patterns in the previous case. So I don't think they would change resistance when normal pressure is applied. They would only change direction when the resistance, when strain is applied along the plane of the
So-
printed lines.
Mhm. So if you want to make your sensor sensitive, okay, to forces, be it normal or let's just say if you're going to do some tensile forces, okay, you're going to just pull it. If you want to make it sensitive, you can't have your conductive trace that you're making. It cannot be too thick, because then it may not be sensitive. It has to be thin. So when you make it thin, you also make it delicate to normal forces as well. So what may happen is some of that cracking may occur just because of that normal force that is acting. Does that make sense? Okay? Okay, so now we are going to play the game of just like how we had done last time, because I can see people yawning. So our, good old quiz 2, kind of similar thing we'll do this time again. We are going to do the same thing, identify the analyte and the transducer. But last time you guys were so good, so this time what I decided to add one more example. So we have instead of 3, we have 4. So feel free to team up 3 and 2 or 2 or 3, the way you guys feel like. So 15 minutes is okay, or 20 minutes? 20 minutes? 20 minutes should be good? Right? Okay. So if you want, you can work in teams, or if you want independently, that's fine. No checking online, huh?
There's a
No.
jargon inside it which I don't understand. I'll make a guess there. I think so. No, you don't know? I don't know. Sketchy.
I hope you don't have somebody outside with the notes, huh?
No, I don't. This is just to make sure I count my steps. Yeah, so we can go down the hall and bring the food into the hall to the person channel to talk about it. I'm keeping it here just in case. Yes, so that's together is what I was saying, the transducers, because they know the
Okay, 5 minutes more. If everyone is done, we can start. Is anyone done? If you need more time, that's fine too. Janvi?
Yeah.
Kinda? Do you need more time? That's fine. You still have 5 minutes, 4 minutes
No,
technically.
I'm struggling with the identification of analyte and transducer in all the examples, so I don't think it's going to help me.
Okay, so because anyway, we're going to go through it, right? So yeah, that's why like what I suggest is like make groups, because like it's a community learning experience. We learn and we teach each other and learn and grow. Okay, so let's take example number 1. Who wants to take a shot of it? At it. Okay. I think she got all the answers when she went out, but I don't know. I don't trust her.
I didn't even take it.
Okay, first.
So the analyte is the temperature with the target.
Okay. How did you decide that it is temperature?
Because it's an optical thermal sensor.
Thermal sensors, it's very obvious.
Yeah.
It's temperature. Okay. So it's temperature.
The transducer is the cholesteric film, which is liquid crystallized.
Okay.
So that's how I know the transducer is. I mean, of course, the colors are present, so it's a.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Cholesteric film, we would discuss about liquid crystals, cholesterol compounds being liquid crystals, and also another good point over there is a broad temperature range of 86 and high sensitivity. So it has a good high sensitivity, and it talks about how the where is it? Yeah. Thermal expansions of the plates, how they are moving and contracting depending on the temperature. So just by reading these, you can say, like, hey, this kind of sounds like those, liquid crystal stuff, right? Okay, good.
The analyte type is physical and the transducer is
Okay. Yeah.
colorimetric. I know it's physical for everything.
Physical is for everything, of course. And transducer will be
Optical.
optical.
Do you say optical or do you say colorimetric?
Colorimetric would be something that changes color, so this will be classified. So colorimetric is a subclass of optical because it could be fluorescence based.
Oh, yeah.
So in case of fluorescence based, what you have is you have to excite that system with a specific wavelength, and then it produces fluorescence. In case of colorimetry, it is all spontaneous. You don't need any additional stuff to shine on it. Okay. Okay, good. Who wants to take a stab at 2? Okay.
So the analyte and temperature as well?
Okay, because it clearly says thermal sensor. It talks about, the Seebeck coefficient. Even if you don't know what that means, it's 40 microvolt per Kelvin. Kelvin is a unit of temperature, so it clearly indicates it's a temperature sensor.
Then the transducer is the PDOT.
Okay.
So the classification based on analyte is a physical sensor.
Yeah.
And then it's also a electrochemical sensor.
How did you come across that?
Since it says a thermoelectric.
Yeah, thermoelectric. Thermo means heat, electric.
Sorry, the next line. It's been synthesized. Sorry, yeah, so it's a thermoelectric material, and then the way it reflects the temperature change is to
So right now, I don't expect you guys to know what is this thermoelectric based temperature sensor or anything. I'm not going to that extent. I just want to answer these basic questions. Okay. So we know just by the name thermoelectric, thermal, electric, temperature, so just like piezoelectric, force causing some electrical changes, thermoelectric means temperature causing some electrical changes. And if that was not obvious, then also when you look at this unit, 40 microvolt per Kelvin, so there is some relation between temperature and voltage, which is an electric, parameter, right? So you can kind of guess from that. Okay, let's take the case, example number 3. Who wants to go now? Okay.
I said that the target is pressure.
Okay.
In this case. The transducer is the.
So, can somebody tell me what is the difference between or relation between pressure and force, or are they the same?
Per unit, force per unit area.
Yeah, pressure is force per unit area. Okay, so okay. What is the transducer here?
It's the all fabric network with the patterned nanofiber dielectric layer. So it's basically a textile capacitor.
Okay, so I'm just going to write AFCS. Okay, I'm not going to write the entire big long name.
So it's a physical measuring pressure, and then I said it was capacitive / electrical, but I wasn't entirely sure if it also classified as piezoelectric or not.
Yeah, I mean, yes, because like usually piezoelectric term is more reserved for intrinsic properties of the material when they change, rather than like here when you're changing just the resistance and all these things. So they call it piezo resistive and also piezo capacitive and all these things. But the piezoelectric, that term, again, it's kind of loosely used. But like if you ask a purist, where to use this word, they will go for a material that has this intrinsic property. So the material's crystal structure, that will kind of change depending on the force, and the electrical activity will change, rather than just because of the separation and cracking and all these things. Does that make sense?
So
But yeah, that was a good question.
So then it would just be capacitive in this case.
Yeah, capacitive. Yeah.
Can I comment on this?
Yeah.
I mean, because it has fabric and I am from textiles.
Sure.
Just in case. So basically, when you talk about capacitive sensor, the plot that you get to change, it's as far as textile is considered, they see a change in capacitance directly, but for fabric, when you say that piezoelectric is reserved for piezoelectric material, that is true, but for fabric, if you have a change in electric current or something of that sort, with a fabric that contains a conductive, that just one second. Yeah, so what I meant was that a fabric which changes the flow of current across it without necessarily having a piezoelectric material onto itself, just with a coating, they
Sure.
can also be considered piezoelectric.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. The word is kind of like, loosely used, so you can call them, but when the word was coined, like, what kind of materials are piezoelectric materials? These are these lead, zirconate, like titanium, they're called like PZT materials and all these things. So the material itself, at the crystal structure, that level, that's where it shows piezoelectric properties. Okay. Now these textiles, and for example, this example, also the example that you were giving, these are not intrinsic properties of the textile material, right? I mean, this is something that you printed on it and you are stretching. So yeah, you can use those terms, and people use those terms widely. Okay, but as I said, like, if you ask a purist, that person is going, nah, this is not piezoelectric. They may argue and not say that these are not piezoelectric. These are basically just resistive or capacitive sensors. Okay, example number 4. Who wants to go with it? It's okay to be wrong. I want you guys to be wrong, so I feel that I'm teaching you guys something.
That's not how you measure it.
All right.
Yeah. So the first one would be pressure.
Okay. How did you come across? Why do you say that?
It just talked about the pressure sensing abilities of the
Yeah,
sensor.
it's clearly stated there. Okay, good.
The transducer would be the nano sheets.
The nano sheets, the SN, SE2,
2D,
yeah, SE2 nano sheets. Is that what they call nano sheets? Okay.
Yeah. The analyte sensor would be physical,
Okay.
and then the transducer was piezoelectric.
Okay.
It might change this.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at that figure, you can clearly see. So basically, they clearly show they have these nano sheets. When there is no force, they are kind of separate from each other. So the resistance is high, and that's why the current is low, right? I mean, what they are basically doing is you're just using this equation. Now they're applying a constant voltage. So this is constant. And what is changing is the resistance, depending on how those plates are stacked. If they are not stacked, if they are pulled apart, the plates are going to be separated, so the resistance is going to increase across the plate. So what you see is the resistance increases, and hence the current decreases. Okay, and when you compress them, the plates come close to each other. Okay, you have a higher lower resistance, and the current increases. Okay, cool. All right. So it seems to me that you guys are all ready to solve real life problems. So I'm going to take the liberty and give you some simple homework. Okay, so identify best options for developing a sensor. Okay, and we are going to take a simple case of glucose sensor. Okay, all right.
So, sorry,
Yeah.
everyone taking glucose sensor or?
Yeah, so we have, not we, you guys have to develop, a glucose sensor for the 3 cases that I'm going to be discussing. Okay, so you have to think, in this case, what are the problems? which kind of glucose sensor I will have to, what are the options that we have to develop. I don't care, you guys can work in teams, you can do it independently, doesn't matter, okay? Okay, so the first case is, you have to develop a glucose sensor for patients suffering from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, so as the name suggests, obstructive pulmonary disease, so this means they have breathing problems. So this basically means they're their oxygen levels in the blood is compromised. They have a lot of problems with that, and you have to develop a glucose sensor for them, because commercially available glucose sensors for some reason are not sensitive, and they have a lot of errors in it. So you have two options. Which kind of transducer you'll? I'm going to send these things. It will be there in the slides when I upload. So you'll have this with you, okay? If you know the answer, please don't give it right now. Think about it. So the next case is the case of mountaineers. When these mountaineers, especially when they're above 7,000 meters, there's a lot of exertion. They are losing a lot of energy, and they are not carrying a lot of food with them. So it's like the perfect recipe for going into hypoglycemia, which is basically low blood glucose levels. And this is why a lot of the people, they have giddiness, and then like a lot of the people die because of these hypoglycemic conditions. So a team of mountaineers have approached you to develop a sensor, a reliable sensor for them. Okay. You have talked to some experts. They have given you some, challenges that are there. So based on this information that is available, which option would you select as the best route for developing your glucose sensor? Okay. And the third last case is designing a sensor for a bioreactor. Again, here the same analyte, glucose. So basically, what these bioreactors, so in a lot of these companies, chemical companies, biopharma companies, they have these big bioreactors, and they basically culture or grow these microbes and other living organisms. And these organisms produce specific chemicals, which is basically the chemical that they want. Okay, so they will take that chemical for profits. But the thing is, this bioreactor, as the name suggests, is a living entity, right? You have all these microorganisms growing inside it. And in order for them to produce the product that you want, you need to make sure that you are supplying them sufficient food and all the nutrients that it requires. And one of the nutrients is glucose. So you kind of have to tune how much amount of glucose you actually have to put in the bioreactor. If you put too much, the production may be too much production, and then that may create a lot of problems downstream. That is one thing. The other thing is also when you provide a lot of nutrients, these organisms may grow uncontrollably, and then they may start, basically killing each other because they are just overproducing so much. Okay, so you have to very carefully tune how much amount of glucose you're adding. So this basically means you have to measure the glucose that is present in that, that bioreactor soup that is basically in that container. So a company has again, come to you, say like, hey, you have taken this course. We know that you are an expert now in sensors, and we want you to design a sensor for us. We have this special bacteria, which it's a thermophilic bacteria which grows at like high temperatures, and we want you to develop a sensor because there is nothing available in the market. Okay, so again, you have these three options, and you can select which option would be the best route to make them. Sounds good? Again, work in teams, work independently, it doesn't matter to me. Questions? Or yeah.
For this one specifically, trying to word this in a way that makes sense. Does this one have to be, the other ones are kind of like point rapid test. This one, is it a point rapid test or is it continuous?
Continuous. This will be more, no, it could be either,
Okay.
Yeah, it could be either. It could be continuous monitoring. It could be like, hey, you know what, I don't need to measure it every time. 3 times a day or once a day, is good enough for us to know what is going on inside the reactor.
Okay. Do we have to submit in like in a form, like a document or something? Or
Oh no, we are just going to have a discussion. Yeah. Yes, it's a casual class, don't worry. Yeah.
So it'll be next class, right?
Yeah, next class, the first thing, we will discuss these things. Okay, it will be an open discussion. We'll discuss why we selected a particular option, because you not only have to choose a particular, but also give a cogent reason of why you think you selected this. Okay, I mean the initial homeworks or so I'm kind of going to do like this, because we are still in the initial phase of the class, right? So I don't want to say, oh, write a one-page document or anything like that. So that will come later on. Does that sound good? Okay, any other questions? Okay, all right. Okay, then I'll see you guys on Thursday. And on Thursday, we'll talk a little bit about geography in the nano class.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Sure.
I'm confused about the analyte. I was taking it as, like how it's mentioned in the figure, like one particular like lactose or pH.
Yeah.
I took it in that sense, so I was trying to find out what is the analyte.
Yeah. So if you see, I mean, this is just a rough schematic, right? So the analyte, it can be of different types: physical analytes, chemical analytes. So in last class we discussed these chemical analytes, okay, and what are the different transducers and the receptors for these. And in this class we were focusing more on the physical ones.
So no, my confusion is, okay, when you talk about classes of sensors, so when you're talking about over here, like what is the type of sensor based on the analyte, then I understand, okay, it's physical. But when you're talking about like identifying the analyte, so okay, I mean that's what I was that's like I'm looking for one particular like some material or something, but like over here like it's just temperature.
Yeah. So you see over here, because when you talk about material, that is like a chemical.
Okay.
Right? So it like material could be glucose, it could be DNA, it could be virus particles, it could be drugs, whatever. Okay, so it is actually like a chemical.
Okay.
But like the physical are more something that you can't really touch, temperature, force. So that's why you kind of classify them in that
Got
sense.
you. Like if it would have been chemical, I would have found like
Exactly.
a DNA or something in it.
Yeah.
But like since it's physical, it has to be temperature
Yeah,
or something.
yeah. So if this is the last class.
I missed the last class.
Yeah,
sorry.
that's okay. I think we did the same thing in the
Towards
last
the
class as well. Yeah, so see this one, the exact same thing we did, and this time, at the last time we basically did all of it was like the material based, the chemical ones. So this is for glucose, this is for some other chemical, and so on and so forth. So we had like taken 3 examples.
Okay, in case I will have a problem, even you.
Sure,
because I
yeah,
think I'm
yeah.
still a little confused, but I'm just gonna
Yeah.
try again.
Yeah.